Look at it and just listen. I mean, it's beautiful. You can hear the trees and all this, yeah. You know, there's just something about this place. It's quiet.
3, 2, 1, 0 time.
Mississippi, 1964. It is Freedom Summer in the midst of the Civil Rights battle. It is also the height of the Cold War.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
Just 2 years earlier, the nation stood on the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Both sides were testing atomic weapons and trying to keep it secret by doing it underground.
One of the things that the Soviets learned was that treaties can be meaningless. There was a treaty of non-aggression between Stalin and Hitler in 1938 and 39. In 1941, Hitler basically threw it in the garbage can and attacked Russia. So any nuclear testing treaties, especially ones forcing testing underground, were suspect. But if it's one thing that the Soviet Union believed in, and that's technology. And so by allowing them all of the pertinent information, making this actually one of the most public nuclear tests ever conducted of both of these, it was a form of communication. It was a form of communication between technocratic nations, and it was something that the Soviet Union could trust. That is data, scientific data, while they observed our tests. And indeed, they actually replicated these tests in the Soviet Union several years later, I believe in 1973.
And they were trying to figure out what Russia was doing. So those were put there. They had boats at sea that would pick up the blast, and they could measure, they knew the intensity of the blast here. So they figured that way they could figure where Russia was doing and what Russia was doing, even if it was underground. And that was my understanding of what the atomic bombs were there for.
That is what led the government here to a remote spot in Lamar County. Typically, atomic testing took place in the deserts of Nevada and New Mexico. Lamar County would become the first and only site east of the Mississippi for an atomic test.
The Atomic Energy Commission went through a whole process to try to find places that were suitable. And they sort of threw a wide net, and the salt it does have some properties that are useful for this. So they were sort of interested in that. Mississippi was known, Louisiana is known really for its salt domes. They were just beginning to develop them pretty extensively. So that was sort of the thing that attracted the federal government's attention to come to Mississippi.
They chose that because it was a salt dome area, and supposedly it would stay down below. Initially, my understanding was that they were trying to set off 2 atomic bombs and 2 normal explosions that they knew the intensity of.
Project Dribble involved 2 different tests. The first in 1964 was called Salmon. The second blast 2 years later was called Sterling. Before the Salmon test, residents were offered $10 to evacuate, $5 for children.
And there's some that didn't have a way to go, that they had to get somebody to carry them. There's one over on Salt Dome Road. She didn't drive, and all her family lived in Hattiesburg. Her husband had already passed away. And they'd carry her somewhere. They'd go pick her up. And she'd tell them, "You'll have to come get me. I'm not going without somebody come and get me." They'd go get her and take her somewhere and then bring her back.
Salmon involved drilling a half-mile deep into the salt dome and exploding a device a third as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. On Thursday, October 22, 1964, a nuclear bomb was detonated in Mississippi.
I was tickled. It was the day out of school. Oh yeah, we knew what was going on. We just didn't know what to expect. And the men that was over it, they'd come around, they'd talk. They had been out in Nevada when they shot them off, and they'd come over here and try it over here and see what it'd do. We didn't really know what to expect. We just knew it was supposed to be a bomb. But I had a lot of fun because I got out of school. I asked one of the men that was over it all about why it shook so bad. He said, well, we can't tell how big a bomb is till we blow it up.
Well, I had a chemistry professor over at the University of Southern Mississippi that had his feet propped up on his desk and actually got tipped over from the blast effects from the Salmon event. That was the first of the 4 events down there.
As a matter of fact, they had no idea how strong the blast would be, and many anticipated that in Hattiesburg and actually in Baxterville, that the shock wave from the blast would be no more than if you jumped off a curb. Boy, were they wrong.
I didn't know nearly as much as most 10, 12-year-olds do now, and to us it was just, we were all going to get together, and all our friends, all our family, all our kids we played with, kids in the neighborhood, and it was just like a party. But then when they said nobody could sit, everybody had to stand because it could hurt you, then that was a little scary. But we really had no clue. They didn't tell us very much. They really didn't. They just said be there because it could shake windows, basically, is what my dad said they told them. And I remember there was a lot of people out there. We were kids, we were really excited because they brought sandwiches and Cokes and they brought cookies.
Today, Dorothy Brashears works at Morgan's grocery store in Purvis. She is 50 years and a few miles from the first test.
It was pretty flat out there, and you could see it when it started coming, the ground rise, and it looked like waves of coming towards you. Then when it got under your feet, everybody, you know, it got right there, you were pretty freaked out. But it went under your feet, and it was just a little boop. But there was a lot of people had cows and things, and cows didn't know to stand up, and it ruptured their stomachs. A lady that lived not too far from us, when she went home, she was crying because her whole chimney fell in. People's dishes and things fell, but nobody really knew what to expect.
After the last test, the federal government monitored the area for a period of years before turning it over to the state. Since then, various state agencies have checked the soil, water, vegetation, and livestock.
There's wells that's drilled in all the different aquifers that are on top of the salt dome. And what we do is when we go down there, we actually pump the water out of the wells until we get a constant temperature and a constant pH-D of the water. So we know that that's the actual sample. And we take that sample after letting it run for about an hour and bring it back to our lab and then test it for tritium and see what components we get out of it. A lot of the wells and everything, we don't get anything you can even detect.
After the last bomb exploded in 1966, the government called the project a success, scientifically and politically.
Also because of such test series, that it meant that the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty, which forbade all tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space, it ensured that all of that former testing could be placed underground and a certain amount of monitoring could be conducted. And that's where a lot of the importance of these tests lie.
Nuclear testing in Mississippi seemed like a huge success, but like the test site itself, things on the surface were not what they appeared.
People trusted the government back then a lot more than they do now. And so they really weren't concerned either. Nobody was very concerned.
What had happened was that they were placing water, brine solution, at the bottom of the chamber to perform some tests to make sure that the walls of the chamber weren't crumbling, that it was solid and it was stable. And some of this brine flashed over into steam, and it burst up through the ground like a gusher, like a geyser. And it irradiated several workers. And the water, came to the surface and ran along the surface into surface pits. The workers were successfully decontaminated according to the records. But it was during those drill back operations that radioactive materials came to the surface.
The problem was tritium, a nuclear isotope that is harmless in small quantities. But Project Dribble produced massive amounts.
We found a lot of tritium. Not enough so that it would have been a radiological concern, but enough to warrant continued monitoring.
That's what Kaiser thought too. In the late 1970s, he was invited to bring a group of university students to the test site to study frogs and vertebrates.
Some of our seining nets were hot, radioactively hot. And we found ourselves with it. We ran a Geiger counter on it. And we called in the university authorities, and they had us all stay there, and we had to all shower, and clothes had to be brought to us. We had been told there was no radioactivity. Well, there was. And it was in the seine, and we contacted it, and that's when we complained to the government. You lied to us. You had us take students down into this area. And I said, furthermore, we found out there's a whole bunch of vents going down to the chambers that we put Geiger counters over, and they went red hot. I said, we even got our hands back so quick. It was like getting 20 x-rays in the head.
Kaiser's 1979 report caused a near panic. It talked about unsafe levels of tritium and frogs with tumors and missing limbs. Governor Cliff Finch ordered evacuation of the area, sealed it off, and created a special task force.
Several biological samples were contaminated. Can't say with certainty that it was intentional, but it's certainly, looking at the chemicals that were used to contaminate them, which is radioactive sodium, it certainly seems that the accidental is sort of, that would be harder to believe. And what ended up happening was that certain environmentalists alerted the state government, and the governor of Mississippi at the time, Cliff Finch, ordered an evacuation of this area. So you can imagine, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're dead asleep, and police sirens start sounding in the middle of the night, and sheriffs are knocking on your door saying that you got to get out because of contamination at the Tatum test site. And again, it proved to be false. I'd spoken a few years back when I was researching my book to one of the gentlemen from the Atomic Energy Agency's field offices. His name was Troy Wade. He worked at the Nevada Operations Office. And he said that with the amount of radiation coming out of these toad liver samples, he said the toad would have had to have weighed 400 pounds if it was to still be alive, which would be an obvious indication that something is not right at the site.
Kaiser chaired the state task force and was shocked to find his study was based on faulty data. Chemists at the University of Mississippi used petri dishes contaminated with radioactive sodium.
When the Department of Energy did the testing, they were cold. I couldn't believe it. I said, our people said they were hot. I said, see for yourself. Every one of those samples were cold. No radioactivity. You think about embarrassing. Anyway, Ed Meek was Director of Public Relations then for us, and he and I were on a plane, and we flew back to Oxford. We were stunned. We didn't know what the heck had happened. And the head chemist met us at the airport, and I'm not going to name him, but he was crying. Had found out that it was not correct, that all that data they'd been feeding us was not correct, and he had no idea why. They would not conclude it was sabotage. or they wouldn't even mention it. But some members of the committee told me personally it looked like the university chemistry department had been sabotaged by somebody. Was it or not? I don't know. I don't have any idea. But draw your own conclusion there. No, here's what happened with why did we get the tumors? The tumors were amphibians, frogs, salamanders, okay? They were living in water which had tritium. Tritium is a beta emitter. You can drink it because it goes through you. But if you live in it, it will kill you or cause tumors. They admitted the water was full of tritium down there. So again, that apparently explained the tumors. But they never told us about the tritium either. They said there wasn't anything down there.
Coincidence or not, shortly after the frog tests came out, area residents began complaining of higher cancer rates. Starting in 1980, the state began looking at cancer rates within 20 miles of the test site. Every year, the tests showed no abnormalities.
Everybody's suspicious. Nobody believes the government, but as far as I can tell, the government's never done a whole lot to make anybody to believe them.
We've always done testing in the area to see if there was risk. There's no evidence that there's any threats to public health. And we've monitored the site with a Department of Energy grant to assure that there's no public health threats.
My uncle worked over there a little bit, and he went over there after it was over. Back then, they would let you go and come as you please. Nobody really cared. And he went in, and he said he found this really warm stream. It was just a nice little hole. And he said a lot of fish in it. And he caught little brim, little bitty brim out of there. He brought them home, and my grandma cooked them for him. And he had a big old white cat. Well, after he ate, he fed the bones and everything, what was left, to the cat. A few months later, and I can't tell you how long, my uncle got cancer in his stomach, and the cat got a big cancer on its lip, and they both died about the same time. But he said the water in that area was really, really warm.
You have places that handle creosote and furans and dioxins and other chemicals that were used to preserve wood. This is timber area and lumber area. That would have been handling a lot of creosote. Creosote is a carcinogen. You know, you don't want to get it on you, and you don't want to ingest it. So there's a lot of chemical pollution around here as well, and so trying to discern what causes people to get sick, it's not a cut and dried situation.
If those radionuclides are kept inside the salt, probably it's safe. But that's a big if, and there are things that can happen, and again, it comes down to monitoring. We've got to keep a close eye on the site.
That's what Johnny Green and Ron Forsyth went to find out, if it could be contained. The Geological Survey started testing in the 1970s with the Department of Radiological Health monitoring the safety of workers.
Well, one report would say the groundwater was moving to the southwest at so many feet per year. Another one would say it's moving to the northwest at so many feet to the year. Another one would say to the northeast. Well, the regional water flow down there is to the southwest. And so I started looking at that. Some of these reports are contrary to what we thought the regional flow would be. And so that's what kind of perked my ears up as to what's going on here.
There was a lot of water that was generated during the blast, so there's some water there. There's a lot of salt, sodium chloride, and what else is there? Only the Lord knows.
The government buried some of the waste near the surface, waste from the chamber, explosion chamber. And they later admitted that was hot. And they took that off, they came in, dug it all up, took it off, and they plugged those pipes.
That at night there was dump trucks came out of there with dirt, and they would just cover them with tarps, and that they would come out there. But when they asked them, what are you doing, nobody wanted to talk about it.
We know that a lot of it was taken from the site by rail back to the Nevada test site and disposed of. The rest of it is underground.
Steve Thompson was in high school when the first bomb detonated. Shortly after graduation, his uncle hired him to work on the cleanup crew.
I had a Timex watch that I threw down in the hole because of the radiation. But those little old suits, I don't see how they protected us. And little white suits, they washed them every night. They just run the Geiger counter over us when we started out every day. If it beeped, they'd find where it was beeping at.
If it was properly contained, it will always be there for quite a long time, but it should not be a major issue as far as surface environments are concerned. And the big question is, did they contain that properly? Is it contained? And I think those are some of the questions that people still sort of talk about.
Well, I learned through this whole experience that radiation is something to be respected, but it's not something necessarily to be feared. You can mention radiation and people start thinking of cancer and first one thinking another. And like I say, you have to get a lot of it, as it was explained to me, over a fairly short period of time to be a health hazard. But it was a concern of ours to try to make sure that the people in the area were safe from something like that.
Well, let's just put it this way, I don't think they'll ever do that again here in Mississippi. They ran into too many unknowns. The Nevada test site, because it's got a very low population density, is a much better place to test nuclear weapons.
The Department of Energy, and I've talked to some representatives from the DOE, they freely acknowledge they could have done more to inform residents and to keep them in the loop. And I'm hoping they learned from their mistakes. But I think the people who live around here and the people of the state of Mississippi who remember these tests should learn about what they were really doing and what they were really for. And that there's a lot of reason to be proud of it, even their sacrifices and their inconvenience. This was important. This is very important. And one of the reasons why we haven't had a nuclear war. This is one of the places where the science that was conducted that allowed communication between the superpowers was conducted. But in many cases, there are important historical events that have happened in your own backyard that people haven't paid attention to, that people don't pay attention to. And again, a nuclear test site, the only one east of the Mississippi River, and relatively unknown. This is, this is an important story and a contribution to world international diplomacy on a southern site and for all intents and purposes, backwater Mississippi. But it's not. So much happened here. Yeah, I like this place. I really do. There's something about the soil.